When I first met Sam, it felt like the universe was finally throwing me a lifeline. At 21, I had just left a tumultuous relationship and wasn't even looking for love when he walked into the bookstore where I worked part-time. He wasn't the type of guy I usually went for, too clean-cut, almost preppy. But he had this easy smile and a way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. For months, our relationship was nothing short of magical. Sam was attentive, always surprising me with little gifts that showed how much he paid attention. A signed copy of a book by my favorite feminist author. A hand-knit scarf because I'd once mentioned I'd never learned to knit. He was also ambitious, already climbing the ladder at a tech startup. It felt like we were the perfect match. Two people driven by passion and curiosity, moving through life hand in hand. We talked about everything. Or so I thought. Our first conversation about politics was early on, during one of those late-night talks that stretch until dawn. I remember the way he leaned back on the couch, watching me with amused admiration as I ranted about reproductive rights and systemic inequality. He agreed with everything I said, or at least it seemed that way. He'd nod, occasionally add a, "Yeah, I totally get that," but never offered much beyond agreement. At the time, I took it as a sign of his support. He wasn't challenging me because he saw my points as valid and undeniable. Looking back, it feels more like a silence that should have spoken volumes. There were little signs, of course, things I now see in sharper focus. Like the time I'd made an offhand comment about Elon Musk's absurd, world-saving claims, and Sam had chuckled but quickly changed the subject. Or the way he seemed uncomfortable whenever I brought up my activism work. Still, these moments felt insignificant compared to the overwhelming love and support he offered in other areas. January 20th started like any other day. I had an early shift at the bookstore, and Sam was working from home. Over breakfast, we joked about the cold snap and made plans to try that new sushi place downtown for dinner. Everything felt so normal, until it wasn't. The news was on in the background while I packed my bag. President Trump's inauguration. The sight of it made my stomach churn, as it always did. I couldn't help but voice my frustration. It's just surreal, you know? Knowing we've got 4 more years of this nonsense, it's like the whole country's lost its mind. I expected Sam to nod along like he always did. Instead, he let out a heavy sigh. "Can we not do this today?" he said, his tone sharper than I'd ever heard. Confused, I stopped mid-sentence. "What? I voted for him, okay?" His words came out in a rush, like ripping off a Band-Aid. "I support him." It took a moment for his words to register. I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. But there was no laugh, no telltale grin. Just Sam, standing there with a resigned expression. Work that day was a blur. My mind kept circling back to Sam's confession. How could I have missed it? How could I have been so blind? Every memory of our conversations played back in my head, now tinted with suspicion and doubt. When I got home, the apartment was quiet. Sam was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up when I walked in, his face a mix of guilt and defiance. "We need to talk," I said, setting my bag down. "I figured," he replied, his voice soft. What followed was one of the hardest conversations of my life. I told him how I felt. Betrayed, deceived, like the foundation of our relationship had been a lie. He tried to explain his perspective, how he'd grown up in a conservative household, how he'd struggled to reconcile those values with my liberal ones. "I didn't lie to you," he insisted. "I just didn't want to fight. I thought it didn't matter as much as us. But it did matter. It mattered because it wasn't just about politics. It was about trust, about shared values, and the kind of life we wanted to build together." Over the next few weeks, I wrestled with my feelings. Every time I looked at Sam, I saw the man I'd fallen in love with, but also the man who had quietly hidden a part of himself from me. Could I overlook this? Could we make it work despite our differences? I confided in friends, debated endlessly with myself, and even started therapy to untangle my emotions. Slowly, I began to see the situation for what it was. A crossroads. I loved Sam deeply, but love alone couldn't bridge the gap between us if we couldn't be honest with each other. In the end, it came down to one final conversation. Sitting across from each other at the kitchen table, I laid everything out. My fears, my frustrations, my hopes for our future. Sam listened, truly listened, for the first time. And when it was his turn to speak, he did so with a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. "I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." We agreed to rebuild, brick by brick. It wouldn't be easy, but we both knew the love we had was worth fighting for. We set boundaries, promised to approach our differences with respect and curiosity, and committed to open, honest communication moving forward. It's been a year since that day. Sam and I are still together, and while we're not without our challenges, we've learned to navigate them together. Our relationship isn't perfect, but it's real. And for now, that's enough.